I want her as my mother," the CEO's daughter cried, pointing at the maid. Daniel Whitmore stood at the head of his dining table in his Charleston estate, a glass of champagne trembling slightly in his hand, and made an announcement he believed would heal his broken family. He looked at his 8-year-old daughter, Emma, and told her that the woman beside him, Vanessa Hale, was going to become part of their lives forever. He promised, in front of relatives, business partners, and household staff, that Vanessa would love Emma like her own daughter. What he did not expect was for his daughter to stand up from her chair, point across the table, and say the words that would shatter the evening into silence. "I don't want her. I want Grace. She's the one I want as my mother." The room froze. Vanessa's smile cracked at the edges. And somewhere near the kitchen doorway, a maid named Grace Bennett stood holding a serving tray, her hands suddenly unsteady, wishing more than anything that she could disappear into the walls of a house that was never supposed to become her home. Before we go further, take a moment to subscribe, like this video, and tell me where you're watching from. It truly means a lot to see how far these stories connect with people around the world. Now let me take you back to where this all began. Because to understand why an 8-year-old girl would humiliate her father's fiancée in front of a room full of guests, you have to understand what that little girl had already lost and what she was terrified of losing again. 8 years earlier, Daniel Whitmore had been a different man. He was already wealthy then. His real estate firm had made him one of the youngest self-made millionaires in South Carolina, but wealth had never been the thing that defined him. His wife, Claire, had been the center of his life, the reason the enormous house on the edge of the marsh ever felt warm instead of hollow. When she went into labor that spring evening, Daniel had been certain that by morning he would be holding both his wife and his newborn daughter in his arms. He was only half right. Complications during delivery took Claire before sunrise. The doctors handed him his daughter, wrapped in a hospital blanket, and told him that his wife had not survived. Daniel remembered standing in that hallway, holding a baby he barely knew how to hold, hearing a nurse say gently, "Sir, your daughter needs you," and realizing that grief and fatherhood had arrived in the same breath, and there was no separating them ever again. He raised Emma alone for 8 years. Nannies came and went. Relatives offered advice he never asked for. But Daniel refused to let his daughter grow up feeling like an inconvenience passed between strangers. He learned to braid hair badly, to attend school recitals with his phone buzzing in his pocket, to explain, over and over, in 100 small ways, that her mother's absence was not something either of them had done wrong. Still, there were nights Emma would ask why he looked sad whenever she mentioned her mother, and Daniel never quite knew how to answer without breaking something open in himself that he wasn't ready to face. By the time Emma turned 8, Daniel's mother had grown insistent that the house needed more consistent help, someone experienced with children, someone who could manage the household while Daniel worked. That was how Grace Bennett came to stand at the servants' entrance of the Whitmore estate on a humid Tuesday morning, resume in hand, hoping this job would be different from the last one. Daniel's mother, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Eleanor, looked Grace over with the practiced skepticism of someone who had hired and fired more housekeepers than she could count. "Hard work is not enough," Eleanor told her. "You must also be trustworthy. You'll be helping with the house, meals, and Emma's school routine. Do not confuse affection with familiarity." Grace had simply nodded. "I understand, ma'am. I came here to work, and I intend to respect this home." She had no idea, standing there in that marble foyer, that the child she was about to meet would end up needing her more than anyone in that house was prepared to admit. Emma appeared at the top of the staircase moments later, arms crossed, studying the newcomer the way children study anyone who might be another temporary face in a house full of temporary faces. "You must be the new house help," Emma said flatly. "I'm Grace," she answered simply. "You can call me that if you'd like. Everyone else tells me to call them Auntie before I even know their name." Grace crouched slightly, meeting her eyes. "Then get to know me first. The Auntie can come later." It was such a small exchange. But something about it, the fact that Grace hadn't tried to buy affection with a title, planted the first seed of trust in a little girl who had learned, painfully, not to trust easily. Over the following weeks, that trust grew in the ordinary, unglamorous moments most adults overlook. Grace helped Emma with multiplication tables using candy as a teaching tool, gently insisting that Emma solve the last few problems herself because help should teach you to stand, not make you depend on it. She snuck vegetables into pasta dishes and calmly deflected Emma's protests. She remembered, because Emma had shown her a handwritten recipe card tucked inside an old cookbook, exactly how Claire used to make scrambled eggs, and she made them the same way, without ever making a show of it. Small things. But to a child who had spent years testing whether the adults around her would stay, small, consistent things meant everything. Meanwhile, Daniel had started seeing someone. Vanessa Hale was polished and magnetic, the kind of woman who filled a room with confidence the moment she entered it. She was warm toward Daniel. Genuinely, it seemed, at first, but her warmth toward Emma had a different quality to it, one that Daniel, wrapped up in loneliness and hope, did not notice right away. What Daniel did not know, what only the walls of his own house seemed to know, was that Vanessa's affection came with conditions, and that those conditions had very little to do with love. One evening, Emma wandered toward the restroom near the guest wing and overheard something that would echo in her small chest for weeks. Vanessa was on the phone, laughing quietly to a friend. After the wedding, I'll secure everything I need. Michael's lonely enough to mistake attention for love. Emma didn't fully understand every word, but she understood enough. She understood the coldness underneath the sentence, the way it made her stomach twist. She ran to find Grace that night, unable to hold the secret alone. "Daddy, Sharon only wants to marry him because he's rich," she whispered, the fear in her voice unmistakable. "I heard her tell her friend she'll take what she needs and leave us." Grace knelt down, brushing a strand of hair from Emma's face. "You're afraid she'll replace your mother," she said softly. Fear can make ordinary words sound worse than they are. But even as she said it, comforting the child in front of her, Grace felt an uneasy chill settle in her chest, because deep down, she wasn't entirely sure the words had sounded worse than they were. Vanessa began spending more time at the estate, testing the waters of a life she intended to make permanent. She was calculated about it, kind in front of Daniel, distant the moment his back was turned. She told Emma to bring her school essay to the house help. "That's what your father pays staff for." She refused, more than once, to help with homework or projects, citing that it wasn't part of what she'd agreed to. Grace never corrected Vanessa in front of Emma. She simply filled the gaps Vanessa left behind, quietly, without complaint, without ever trying to make herself look better by comparison. But Emma noticed anyway. Children always notice who actually shows up. One night, Daniel came home late from a business trip, having promised Emma he would return before dinner to help finish her school science project, a model of the solar system. He found Grace and Emma still at the kitchen table, planets carefully arranged, Emma beaming with pride. "This is wonderful," Daniel said, genuinely surprised. "I thought Vanessa was helping you with this." "Vanessa said she wasn't paid to sit with me," Emma said simply, without malice, just stating a fact. Grace finished her work and helped anyway. Later, when Daniel gently raised the moment with Vanessa, she deflected smoothly. "I encouraged her to try it herself, Daniel." Grace stepped in and made it look like I'd abandoned her. "Grace didn't accuse you of anything," Daniel said quietly. Emma did. It was the first small crack in Vanessa's careful performance, and the first time Daniel allowed himself to wonder whether the woman he was planning to marry was who she claimed to be. Somewhere around here, if you've ever had someone in your life who showed up quietly, without needing credit for it, drop a comment and tell me who that person was for you. I read every single one, and I promise, these stories exist because people like that are real. The clearest warning came on a night Daniel would never forget. Emma spiked a sudden fever in the middle of the night, the kind of fever that sends a parent's mind straight back to a hospital room he had never fully left. Daniel sat beside her bed for hours, refusing to leave, refusing to rest, terrified in a way that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the worst night of his life. Grace stayed with him, quietly bringing cool cloths, checking Emma's temperature, and sitting in the corner without ever making herself the center of attention. At one point, exhausted from days of caretaking and sleepless nights, she drifted off in the chair beside Emma's bed. When Daniel noticed her shivering slightly in the air-conditioned room, he took the blanket off his own shoulders and laid it over her without a second thought. The next morning, Emma, fever finally broken, noticed immediately. "Daddy, you covered Grace with your blanket," she said. eyes wide with the kind of observation only children make out loud. She was cold. Daniel said simply, "Don't start with your morning questions." But Emma had already seen enough. "Daddy likes her," she said later to Grace, matter of fact. "He doesn't give Sharon, I mean Vanessa, his favorite blanket." Grace, flustered, tried to redirect the conversation. "Your father was only being kind, sweetheart. Don't build a wedding out of one blanket." "I'm not building it," Emma said. "I'm just showing him where the house already lives." It was an unsettling sentence from an 8-year-old, wise beyond her years in the particular way children become wise when they've had to watch adults closely just to feel safe. Vanessa noticed the shift too, and it frightened her far more than she let on. She began watching Grace more closely, not with warmth, but with the calculating eyes of someone protecting territory. When a contractor named Ryan Coleman, who was helping renovate part of the estate, stopped one afternoon to help Grace carry groceries she was struggling with, Vanessa seized the moment. "You and Ryan seem comfortable with each other," she said coolly to Grace afterward. "He was helping me carry food, ma'am," Grace answered. Comfort didn't enter into it. "He was making you laugh." "Am I not allowed to laugh while I work?" Later, alone with Daniel, Vanessa pushed further, planting a seed she hoped would take root. "You were jealous," she told him, watching his face carefully. "You didn't ask Ryan why he was smiling. You only asked Grace." Daniel brushed it off outwardly, but something in him had already begun to notice things he wasn't ready to name. The tension in the house thickened with every passing week. Vanessa grew colder toward Grace in private, sharper in the small comments she made when Daniel wasn't listening. "Remember," she told Grace one afternoon, her voice like silk wrapped around a blade, "the work does not require you to make him laugh or raise his child like she belongs to you." "Emma belongs to herself," Grace answered evenly. "Caring for her doesn't mean I'm claiming her." "Good," Vanessa said, smiling without warmth. "Because men like Daniel may appreciate good service. But they don't marry women like you." Grace said nothing. She had learned, over years of quiet work in other people's houses, that dignity sometimes meant not answering cruelty with more of the same. Around this time, Ryan, the contractor, began showing more open interest in Grace, eventually asking her to dinner on her one evening off. Grace hesitated, aware of how it might look, but eventually agreed to one meal, telling him plainly, "I can agree to dinner. Just don't arrive with expectations I didn't invite." When Emma found out, in the way children always find out everything, she went straight to her father. "Ryan asked Grace to go out with him," she announced, watching Daniel's reaction closely. "That's Grace's private matter," Daniel said, a little too quickly. "Why are you telling me?" "If it's private," Emma said, with the blunt honesty only a child can get away with, "then why did you just tear that paper in your hand?" Daniel looked down. He hadn't even realized he'd crumpled the document he was holding. That night, when Grace returned from dinner just before 10, Daniel was still awake, pretending to review paperwork in his study, which he checked more than once. "You're back late," he said. "It's not even 10, sir," Grace answered. "My evening off doesn't end until morning." "Did you enjoy yourself?" "Yes. Ryan is easy to talk to. Nobody questioned every answer I gave." The words landed harder than either of them expected. Daniel, frustrated with himself more than with her, said quietly, "Ryan doesn't even know you." "Then maybe that's exactly why it troubles you that he wants to," Grace said, and immediately regretted how honest it sounded. Daniel didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its edge. "This conversation isn't about Vanessa anymore, is it?" "That's exactly why it should end," Grace said quietly, "before either of us says something that can't be taken back." She turned and walked toward the kitchen, leaving Daniel standing alone in the hallway with a truth he had been avoiding for weeks. Everything came to a head 3 days before Daniel and Vanessa's engagement dinner, the same dinner Emma would later interrupt in front of the entire family. Eleanor, Daniel's mother, had grown suspicious of Vanessa for reasons of her own. She had noticed inconsistencies in the story Vanessa told about her background, small contradictions that didn't add up. Quietly, without telling Daniel, she'd asked a private investigator to look into Vanessa's financial history. What came back stunned even Eleanor. Vanessa Hale was not simply a woman who had fallen for a wealthy widower. She had done this before, twice. 2 prior engagements to wealthy men in 2 different states. both ending abruptly once significant assets had been transferred into joint accounts or once she had convinced each man to name her as a beneficiary on life insurance policies. Both engagements had collapsed the moment each man began asking questions. Both times, Vanessa had vanished before any legal consequences could catch up to her, moving to a new city, adopting a slightly adjusted version of her story, and starting again. Eleanor brought the file to Daniel 2 nights before the engagement dinner, sliding it across his desk without a word. Daniel read through it in silence, his face draining of color as the pattern became undeniable. The same wording in old engagement announcements, the same suspicious timing of financial transfers, and the same trail of broken promises left behind her like debris. He confronted Vanessa that same night, calm on the surface but shaking with quiet fury underneath. "Tell me the truth," he said, sliding the folder toward her. "All of it." Vanessa's practiced composure finally cracked. She didn't deny it outright. She simply grew defensive, then desperate, insisting that this time was different, that she truly did care for him, even as the evidence in front of her told a very different story. "You don't understand what it's like," she said, voice sharp, "to have nothing and to watch men like you throw money at problems you'll never have to worry about." "That doesn't give you the right to lie to my daughter," Daniel said quietly. "It doesn't give you the right to make her feel unwanted in her own home." Still, out of some misplaced sense of obligation, or perhaps simple exhaustion, Daniel did not cancel the engagement dinner immediately. He told himself he needed more time to think, to figure out how to end things without a public scene, without embarrassing his family in front of Charleston's social circle. He was wrong to wait, because 2 nights later, at that very dinner, in front of relatives and business partners, Daniel stood up and made his announcement, the one meant to reassure Emma, the one he thought might still, somehow, patch things together. And that was the moment Emma stood, pointed across the table, and said the words that stopped the room cold. "I don't want her. I want Grace. She's the one I want as my mother." The silence that followed felt endless. Vanessa's face shifted through humiliation, anger, and something close to panic as every eye in the room turned toward her. Daniel, still holding his champagne glass, looked at his daughter, this brave, terrified, honest little girl who had just said out loud what half the household had been too polite to say for weeks. He set the glass down. "Emma," he said gently, kneeling to her eye level in front of everyone. "Can you tell me why you said that?" Tears were already sliding down Emma's cheeks. "Because she doesn't love me. She only loves me when you're looking. Grace loves me every single day, even when nobody's watching." Eleanor, standing near the doorway, quietly placed the investigator's folder on the table in front of Daniel. He didn't need to open it again. He already knew what it said. Daniel turned to Vanessa, his voice steady but final. "I think it's time you left this house, Vanessa. Tonight." Vanessa opened her mouth to argue, to salvage what she could, but the expressions around the table, Eleanor's cold certainty, the guest's stunned silence, and Emma's tear-streaked but resolute face, told her there was nothing left to save. She gathered her things and left without another word, the front door closing behind her with a finality that seemed to loosen something tight in every person still standing in that dining room. Grace, who had been standing near the kitchen doorway holding a serving tray the entire time, hands trembling, didn't know what to do with herself. She hadn't asked for any of this. She had never wanted to be the reason a room went silent, the reason a woman was asked to leave, the reason a little girl cried in front of her whole family. She turned to slip quietly back into the kitchen, the way she always did when the house's dramas weren't meant for her. Daniel stopped her before she reached the doorway. "Grace," he said, and something in his voice made her turn around. "Please, stay." In the weeks that followed, the Whitmore house began to feel different, lighter somehow, the way a home feels once the weight of pretending has finally been set down. Daniel didn't rush anything. He didn't turn Grace's role in the household into a headline or a scandal or a fairy tale overnight. Instead, he simply began showing up differently, asking Grace's opinion on decisions about Emma, inviting her to sit with them at dinner instead of serving from the sidelines, slowly dismantling the invisible line the household had always assumed had to exist between them. Emma, for her part, seemed to breathe easier. The fear that had lived quietly in her chest for months, the fear that loving someone new meant losing her mother all over again, began to soften, Not because anyone told her it should, but because Grace never once asked Emma to choose. Loving someone new, Grace told her gently one evening, tucking her into bed, doesn't mean you stop loving your mother. Real love doesn't push anyone else out. It just makes more room. Emma held on to that sentence the way children hold on to the truths that finally make sense of things they've been carrying alone. Months later, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, Daniel found Grace in the garden, sitting where she always sat when she had a few stolen minutes to herself. He didn't say anything grand. He simply sat down beside her, the way he had learned to do over the past several months, and asked if she'd like to stay, not as staff, not as an employee filling gaps in a broken household, but as someone he hoped might choose to build a life alongside his and Emma's, if she wanted that too. Grace didn't answer right away, but when she finally did, her answer wasn't complicated at all. I think, she said softly, I've wanted to stay for a while now. One more thing before we close this story out. If it moved you even a little, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. These stories are for anyone who's ever shown up quietly for someone else, even when nobody was watching, and even when nobody said thank you. Somewhere in Charleston, there's a little girl who no longer flinches when someone mentions her mother, because the woman who raised her afterward never once asked her to forget. There's a father who learned that the people worth trusting are rarely the ones who announce themselves the loudest. And there's a woman who came to a stranger's house looking only for honest work and found something she never expected to find. A family that finally saw her, not for what she could provide, but for who she had been all along. Thank you for watching this story all the way to the end. If it touched something in you, don't forget to like this video, drop a comment telling me what part moved you the most, and subscribe to Untold Maid Confessions so you never miss the next story about the quiet people who show up when the world looks away. We'll see you in the next one.